lovelies, it's France, week 75 of the Journal on Monday series, and I am still working in my Finabert mixed media journal. I am starting my first layer with a mix of picket fence distress stain and some Colorex, which I diluted with water. As you can see, my camera isn't completely where it should be. We've been moving some furniture around in my studio last weekend, and I totally forgot that my camera wasn't going to move with my table. So, next layer is Dylusions spread over a Finabert stencil. And if you'd like more information on the product that I've been using, you will find a complete list of ingredients on my blog. I'm blotting the excess ink away as I want to keep the spraying subtle. What you should be seeing now is me mixing up some fluid acrylic paint with water so that I can add splatters on my page, and then I'm making some prints with a bottle cap. Now my paper was getting quite wonky of those layers, so I decided to glue it down using masking tape on my craft sheet so that I could go back in with the acrylic over the stencil using a piece of cut and dry, and it's easier to do this when your paper is flat on your table. Every time I pick up paint, before I go to the stencil, I take off the excess paint off by blotting the sponge on my craft sheet. I took out a scrap piece of paper. This is a 7 dot studio paper that I trimmed, and now I'm fitting it to my spread. Adding some pieces of chicken wire. And a leftover plaster strip. I have a box full of those little leftovers on my table so that I can grab one when I need it. Then I'm going in with Archival ink and my design cube to add some stamping on the edges. Adding some vintage photo distress ink on the edges of the paper and then gluing everything down. This video is about 19 minutes long, and it took me an hour and a half to tape it. And the most frequent asked question I get is, do you know what you're going to do when you start your spread? In this case today, I only knew how I wanted to start. So I knew I wanted to use the picket fence distress stain with the Colorex, and I knew which color I wanted to use. But other than that, I had no idea where I was going. So once I'm done with this side, I'm doing the same on the other side, gluing everything down after distressing the edges. Then I decided to take out my sewing machine and add some sewing around all those rectangles. While doing so, I was thinking, if my husband would see me do this, I don't know if he would be happy, because every time there's some sewing to do around the house, I bail out. But sewing this didn't seem to be any problem for me. I cut my strips of plaster to the right size, and after spraying some water on it, I can colorize them using Colorex. When you re-wet plaster strips, you have to be quite careful because they become quite delicate. And now that they are dry, I can put them on top of the chicken wire. I'm taking out some vintage trinkets and some metal. Now this wire is, and I have to look, it's annealed iron wire, which means it's wire that has been reheated, which makes it softer and easier to bend and fold. As you can see, I'm just working with my hands, and only for the last part I use some pliers, just because I don't want to hurt my fingers. And as you can see, it's quite thick. You'll find the right dimension on my blog, but working in this kind of journal really allows me to go crazy on texture, and apparently I enjoy it, so I keep going. This is a vintage photo I cut out of a magazine, and as the paper is quite thin, I'm gluing it on a piece of craft basil. These are my home rusted medals, and I'm using a paper clip to add some interest to the photo. Now the paper clip alone isn't enough, so I'm going back in my trinkets box. Those are Finnabair embellishments that I've also been rusting. I think it's pretty distracting on one hand to have the camera not where it should be, but Kirsten told me on Facebook I should tell you that next week I will show you how to unknot your legs. As you can see, I'm sitting to work, so next week I will maybe do a tutorial on how to sit to work, just like I do. But on the other hand, I think it makes things more human, if you know what I mean, because you can really see how I'm moving around while I'm doing my thing. So to keep everything in place, as the chicken wire is quite sturdy, I'm using a very thin metal thread, and I'm just using it like a regular thread to sew down the wire on my page. Then in the back I'm just turning the threads around each other, and I do the same on the other side of the chicken wire. To make sure the chicken wire will stay in place in the back, I'm using some masking tape, and I'm just gluing it on top of the wire. And then doing the same on the other side of the page. I'm using matte accents to glue down the photo on the chicken wire. And the photo will be sandwiched in between the mechanical and the vintage trinket. And I'm using a brad to keep everything in place. placing my colorized plaster strips. And I glue it down either using matte accents or regular tacky glue, depending on what I'm gluing it on. If it's something dimensional like the chicken wire, I like to use matte accents. Now here my chicken wire was really nicely flat, so I could just use tacky glue. And as I have a trinket that will be held in place with brads, I don't need that much glue for the strip, for the plaster strip. The brads will do the work to keep everything down. Checking the layout, and then I can go and place the first metallic circle. This is a reuse. It was something I made for another project, didn't use it, so I can use it now. Again, using a very thin metallic wire to sew it down. Once I'm done sewing down the small circle, I decided to add some butterflies. So I'm using modeling paste over this Finnabair butterfly stencil, but I'm careful not to cover up my center embellishment. So I'm only going around. I left it aside to dry, and once it's dried, I can go in with the Sennelier oil pastels to colorize them. The first one is a very light blue metallic one. So I'm just scribbling on every butterfly. Then I'm going in with a medium blue and blending everything with my finger. I'm pressing pretty hard, but I'm not moving much. So it's more the pressure than the movement that will make the colors blend. And then going in with the darkest blue around the edges and blending it again with my finger. And to make it work better with the background, I'm also going in with a golden oil pastel, but very, very lightly and only on the edges of the butterflies. And then again, blending, but lightly, and I regularly clean my finger to make sure I don't smudge everything. In another piece of leftover, again, I'm cutting some strips. This is the same kind of paper that I was using previously. I'm adding distress ink on all the edges. And then I can use this to create a border on my spread. Once I think I have enough, I'm cutting away the excess so that I can reuse these strips to add some more around the paper. And those who are already glued together, well, I just keep them together and I just glue them back down again. And then again, trimming all the excess away. At this point I wanted to add some sewing around the spread, but before I could do so I had to cut it in half, as it will be in 2 separate pages in my journal. And now I can finally sew down the big metallic circle, again using the very thin metallic wire. As it is a big circle, I'm sewing it in 3 different places. A bit of black soot distress ink on the edges of the paper. And then I can choose the wording I want to use. You can find almost all the wordings that I use on my Pinterest board, to which you can find a link on my blog. To make this piece of paper work with the rest of my spread, I add some rusty hinge distress ink, some vintage photo on the edges, and very light touches of black soot. And then using 3D foam, I can glue it over the circle. Now I wanted a red heart again. Seems this is the red thread all through this art journal. So as I have a leftover hanging heart from Stamp Boutique, I'm colorizing one of the little hearts with my Copic markers. And after trimming it, I can glue it in place. Tiny bit of black soot distress ink on the edges, checking where I want to have it. And once I'm decided, I can go in with my glue. And the finishing touch is a very thin layer of icicle glimmer glaze. As my page is very dimensional and very sturdy, the metal is really sturdy, I'm using a very large double-sided tape to glue it in the journal. And once it was glued, I thought it was lacking some black splatters, so I'm covering up what I want to protect, and then I'm going in with some diluted black acrylic. I hope you liked today's page. See you back next week. Ta-da!